We like to honor tradition on Face the Nation, and each year we talk to authors whose new books have all been named some of the year's best. 4 of them join us now. John Meacham's new book is His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. Peter Baker and Susan Glasser are the co-authors of The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. And Isabel Wilkerson is with us to discuss her latest, Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents. Good to see all of you. Isabel, I want to start with you. You tackle the very difficult subject of race in your book, in which you describe a caste system in our country, where you say skin color is really kind of the metric for where you fall in the hierarchy. Does the awakening within our country this year to the issue of systemic racism begin breaking that apart?
Well, I think that what we've seen in this current year is that despite the record turnout for this election, we have seen the ruptures that are as deep as they've ever been. We still face, disturbing levels of division in our country. This idea of racialized polarization still continues. But I do hope that some of the things that have happened over the last year, this past summer, particularly involving the sense of awakening and outrage over what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many people who have become part of our conversation. I hope that this has been leading us to some type of awakening to get past these divisions.
So you don't believe this is a part of American society that just is foundational and cannot be changed?
Well, I believe that we have seen the enduring nature of the ancient idea, the ancient concept of ranked hierarchy in society, that, the language of caste is not something that we often think of in this country, but it's a term that's been applied to our country by peoples diverse as the abolitionist Charles Sumner and by Dr. Martin Luther King. And we have seen that this is a 400-year-old system that one single election, one single individual does not end, but that it's something that will take everyone to recognize how we got to where we are in order to transcend it.
John, you profiled one of the giants of our civil rights struggle in this country, John Lewis, who we lost this year. And you wrote about his famous march to Selma, where he was severely beaten by law enforcement, even though this started out as a peaceful protest. You said when that footage was shown to the country, there was revulsion all over America. Revulsion, then redemption. Is there anything more American? Right now in America, we had revulsion that Isabel just described again at what happened. Are we at the point of redemption yet?
Well, redemption's a complicated thing, and that's something that we have to work on every day. John Lewis represents, I think, faith in 2 fundamental forces in life. He was on that bridge because of a faith in God, and he was on that bridge because ultimately of a faith in America. Frederick Douglass once said, "There is no soil so conducive to the growth of reform as American soil." And so there is progress is possible. And John used to say, when people would say, well, nothing's ever changed, he would say, when he was a senior member of Congress, "Come walk in my shoes." Now, that's easy for me to say. I'm a white Southern male Episcopalian. Things tend to work out for me in this country. I wrote this book, and I wanted to profile John Lewis because he represents the embodiment of the best that the religious impulse can play in our public life. And more than any other person I've ever known, he closed the gap between a profession of allegiance to the lessons of the Sermon on the Mount with the practice of those virtues. And I think if we look at stories of people who walk among us and who just walked among us, and we see what they did, and they did something so remarkable, that should give us some faith, some inspiration that we can do the same.
Mm-hmm. And part of that process, Peter and Susan, is figuring out how to turn what the country is experiencing into action that falls upon our political leaders. I mean, you cover Washington, the both of you. we're seeing a lot of pressure on the president-elect to do something about race and division in this country. A lot of that early on is focused on representation. Does it end there? How does the president-elect begin dealing with this problem? Peter?
Well, look, it's not just a question of who you put in your cabinet. That's only a start. There's obviously great wounds out there in this country to heal. And this is a president who has talked about doing that. He's talked about being a bridge builder and talked about being a healer and a person who wants to bring America together. We talk about, in our book, we talk about James Baker, not so much as a race healer, but as a bridge builder. We talk about how he tried to work with the other party to make things happen. He tried to work with people from other countries and across the Cold War divide with the Soviets to bring the world together. And I think that what Joe Biden is talking about doing is the same kind of thing, where we can cross these lines and cross these divides and begin to reimagine America in a better way.
Susan, it just feels so different. The divides feel more bitter and deep. How do you do that? And is there something unique to the challenge ahead?
Margaret, I think the thing that was so striking for Peter and I as we worked on this book about, Jim Baker and the 1980s and 1990s in American politics versus today is just how profoundly the political incentives in the country have changed. It's not just that we've had a uniquely divisive president. We're often used to presidents more like Joe Biden, who at least talk and pay lip service to wanting to be a uniter, not a divider. So we certainly had a divisive president, but it's also that we've had a country and a political system that's just lost the ability, it seems, for politicians to work together across the aisle. And in Jim Baker's time, the idea was that the road to political success led through working with Democrats in the odd-numbered years. It led through working with the Soviets at the end of the Cold War. And the question is, has that incentive structure changed so fundamentally that it's actually going to be impossible for even a Joe Biden to come in and sit down and work when the incentives and the reward system has gone in the other direction to be ever more extreme?
And I want to say, in this year of darkness, it's nice to hear some joyful voices behind you there in your backyard, Susan and Peter. Peter, I want to ask you, though, to pick up kind of where you left off, which was, we often looked at history as a guidepost for the future. We look and we revere people like John Lewis. And what you just talked about in terms of leadership of James Baker, people look to that period of time with wistfulness these days at saying, well, look how it used to be. Are we over-romanticizing what it used to be in Washington? And I guess, has the world just fundamentally changed?
Yeah, I think there is a risk of over-romanticizing the past. So clearly, the 80s and the 90s of Jim Baker's era was a partisan era, at times ruthless, at times, a lot of knife fighting, and Jim Baker was part of that during election campaigns. I think the difference is, as Susan said, that when the elections were over, there was a belief that we had to do something, that it wasn't just enough to win power, that you had to use power for some greater purpose. Look at what's happening now with this COVID relief bill. It took the scientists of America less time to develop a vaccine, record time, than it has taken the politicians of America to come together on a plan to spend money to help Americans who are hurting, even though both sides agree that it needs to be done. That's something that has changed. Now, is it permanent? No. We've seen cycles, and John Meacham can talk about this better than I can, in American history where we've gone through periods of division and periods where we've kind of eased back. We'll see where we're going to head in the next few years. But right now we're in a place where the very idea of getting things done has been discredited. And as Susan said, the incentive structure is not pushing anybody toward that.
Mm-hmm. And Isabel, you in your book start off with a pretty stark image of choice and the moment in time. You describe a photo from 1936 in Germany in which a lone man stands in a crowd full of other men. They're all giving Nazi salutes, and his hands are folded. It appears defiant almost. Why did you start on this? What does that signify to you?
Well, I started with that. It's the photo of August Landmesser, who was at a gathering surrounded by adherents to or followers of the Nazis, and he alone was the one man in the image who was not hailing he was surrounded by people who were caught under the spell of the Nazis, and yet he alone was the one who was on the right side of history. And we all would like to believe that we would be on the right side of history in a situation such as that, that we somehow find a way to stand up in favor of justice while we're surrounded by injustice and people who are falling under the spell of that. And so it calls upon all of us to recognize, where we happen to be, what each of us can do, the responsibilities that each of us has. And the reason why I speak about hierarchy and caste is because this is part of our inheritance, of this hierarchy that dates back to the time of enslavement, that essentially was in place for far longer than it was not in place in our country, from Jim Crow, which only ended in the 1960s, and how we live with the after effects of that. And it falls upon each of us to learn the history and to be able to reckon with it.
I'm interested in this idea, though, of what you were describing as a caste system, because in at least political narrative, the past 4 years have been about disruption. They've been about breaking apart systems. They've been about, trying to break apart the establishment in particular. But you have a very different view, right? You think, and have pointed to the 2016 election in particular, as about reinforcing those caste systems.
Well, a caste system essentially is an artificial, arbitrary graded ranking of human value, and it dates back to the time of enslavement. And so we've inherited the assumptions, the stereotypes, the rankings that have essentially been assigned to people based upon what they look like, which goes back to the time of enslavement. And I want to take a moment to remind ourselves of how long this has been a part of our country, that it's a foundation of the power structure that we have inherited. The fact of the matter is, the United States has been that enslavement lasted for so long that it won't be until the year 2022 that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as enslavement alone lasts on this soil. And no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as slavery lasted on this soil. That will not happen until the year 2111. So this is a reminder of how foundational these hierarchies have been, how they have lasted for so very, very long, many, many generations. And of course, this did not end legally until the 1960s, 64, 65, and 68. And this is when, this is really the first time in our country's history in the 1960s that the people who've been assigned to the bottom had been finally brought into the mainstream of American life by law, if not by action, and not by necessarily by everyone's belief, but this was by law. And so this is a fairly new concept, the idea of bringing everyone in our society to the possibility of the American dream. And so we still have a long way to go to work on this.
John, you have used the phrase, the soul of America. We hear that phrase from the president-elect quite often. We've had the election that was supposed to be the fight for the soul of America. Where are we now? Where does that fight go? Are we at absolution? Where are we?
No, we're a long way from absolution, and will be until what Faulkner called the last red and dying evening. My sense of the soul of the country is that soul in Hebrew and in Greek means breath or life, and that the soul is not wholly good or wholly bad, but is an arena of contention in which our better angels, to use Lincoln's phrase, do battle against our worst instincts, many of the worst instincts that Isabel's remarkable work has cast light on. And every day is part of that struggle. To go to what Peter and Susan were saying, division in American life is not the exception, it's the rule. And disagreement and the impulses of appetite and ambition and the clash of interest, all of these things are perennial and universal human forces. What we have to do, what we're called to do by history and by reason and to some extent by faith, is to devote ourselves to the idea and the reality of making real for everybody the promise of the country, which is that we were all created equal and were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And at every point, Isabel mentioned the right side of history, at every point, from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall. The right side of history has been those who stand on the side of individual rights, of the sanctity of the individual, of liberty under law, and of openness. Not of, we build bridges in this country when we're at our best, not walls. And that may sound like a homily, but it has the virtue of being rooted in history. Well, go around Washington. What are the monuments to? The monuments are to imperfect people and imperfect events, but they are ultimately about liberation and not captivity. And that's what the work of politics should be.
Isabel, I wonder, because as we think ahead to the inauguration, there's going to be a lot of symbolism. And there is something kind of unique to modern America, which is where we see multiracial families, multiracial leaders like the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who doesn't fit neatly in a box. Neither does former President Barack Obama. We see marriages across religious lines. Is what we're seeing this undoing of the caste system that you write about? Or, as you reference in the book, you're talking about maybe a bit of a darker turn here, in that you say the United States could potentially look closer to South Africa than what Americans have grown accustomed to.
Yeah, this has been a moment of promise, of course, as we see people who had formerly been marginalized in our country for most of its history now entering spaces where they can have influence over our society in ways that we couldn't have imagined before. Clearly, the biography of Kamala Harris gives us an opportunity to see the ways in which our country may have things in common and that we can actually learn from other societies. Especially in terms of what I'm speaking about, in terms of hierarchy, those points of intersection that we can learn from. But, you know, when my first book came out, The Warmth of the Suns, I mean, one of the things that I would hear all the time, people would say to me is, I had no idea these things happen in our country. I had no idea about what Jim Crow truly was. I had no idea what had happened for the oldest people I might talk to within the lifespan of their own. And so, but not having an idea has consequences. It affects how we vote. It affects the policies that we support. It affects who we hire and who's granted a mortgage, who's treated how, in which way by in the medical industry, who is more likely to contract and die from COVID-19. These are things that affect us. So not having an idea has consequences, and it's time that we have an idea and learn our country's history, learn what's come before us, and learn what we've inherited so that we can begin the work of the hard work of healing and repairing all that's come before us.
Mm-hmm. And in that hard work, Susan and Peter, if I could bring you back into the conversation now, you know, President Trump, as I referenced, was elected on this agenda of disrupting the status quo. Kamala Harris is a symbol of change, as Isabel just sort of described there. Joe Biden, though, is seen as a return of the establishment. What is the choice we are making here as a country? I mean, in some ways, the Biden platform was about restoring where we were.
Well, look, Margaret, it's very hard to imagine a world where we're just going to pretend that the last 4 years didn't happen, right? You know, I think there was a palpable sense of returning to normalcy that powered and animated Joe Biden's campaign. I think that that, combined with the fact that Democrats in the primary decided that they thought he was the most electable person to beat Donald Trump, you know, there's no way that we're going to revert to November 5th, 2016, when it comes to the inauguration on January 20th. But I think, you know, the question is really whether identity politics is the choice that people on both sides of the aisle are making right now. Was it really about a policy platform for Biden or even for Donald Trump? You know, to me, the lesson of the last few years is that people are much more likely to embrace identities and tribalism that they find to be comfortable in our politics right now, at the expense even of a program. Look at how quickly Trump was able to execute essentially a hostile takeover of the Republican Party when it comes to ideology. Things like free trade, being tough on Russia, those were things that we thought of as pillars of the Republican policy agenda. He showed that in fact, Republicans could be very malleable and were more than willing to sign up for his identity-based movement. And so I think the question for Biden is whether those habits of a lifetime on Capitol Hill are still useful and effective when it comes to actually governing what appears to be a somewhat less governable country these days.
A less governable country. Peter, in the course of writing this book, you also reported that Jim Baker voted for President Trump. He fell in line with the party. Is his version of republicanism gone? And does it remain the party of Donald Trump?
Yeah, it's remarkable, actually, in a lot of ways, because Trump is the rejection of many things that Jim Baker stood for. He's a rejection of the party that Jim Baker helped build, along with George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. And yet, Jim Baker, who told us that he thinks Donald Trump is crazy, he thinks he is nuts, he used all sorts, he's been very critical of many of the things that President Trump has done, including most recently in the Western Sahara, a deal to recognize Moroccan sovereignty there, and yet he voted for him. And I think that tells us a lot about what Susan is talking about. We are in a tribal moment in our country. In terms of partisan politics, we are sticking with our side, even if we don't necessarily like the person who is leading our side. And we see that in polls. People did not shift parties so much as turn out in greater numbers for the party that they were more inclined to support. And I think that Jim Baker in some ways is a parable of the modern Republican Party. If you talk to people on Capitol Hill off the record, you get them to tell you what they really think. Most of them don't particularly like Donald Trump, but they've gone along with him because he is popular within their base, and the base right now is what governs politics both in the Republican Party in particular and also in the Democratic Party.
And you just referenced specifically a policy there that Jim Baker spoke out about in regard to a choice he didn't like President Trump made. But then, Susan, you hear from the incoming Biden administration that, you know what, those choices were made and we're not going to reverse some of them, particularly with the Middle East, as Peter just referenced. In fact, we'll build on them. Does the disruption become the new foundation here, or is it about restoration?
Well, again, Margaret, to me, that's the thing that's so notable. You might want a more normal world, right? That word normalcy, has never had such political resonance. But the truth is that, the world has moved on, and there are a number of areas, the Middle East and the recognition of Israel, sort of midwife by the Trump administration, by several Arab countries, obviously is a different fact set and a different reality than the one that was there 4 years ago. Now, Biden is saying that on day one of his administration, he will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, that he wishes to restart the Iran nuclear deal. He, however, has not committed to do something like rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was meant to be the free trade deal in Asia to counter rising Chinese influence. So that's an example of where they're not just snapping back to the status quo ante and Obama administration policies. And I think, it suggests the difficulty of a frame of a presidency that's seen as an antidote to what came before it, as opposed to a forward-looking agenda on its own. And Biden so far has assembled a government that suggests that a sort of certainly a return to competence and expertise, bringing people who served already in senior positions in the Obama administration now will have, in some cases, more senior positions in the Biden administration. So there's a continuity, and then I think that the message to people is that Trump represents a discontinuity in American politics and policy. But it's unclear that that's really the case. And I think, to John's point, we're not just going to wash away the last few years. That's not how this is going to work. It's not over. It's not even the beginning of over. We're not just going to wake up one day and it's all going to be some crazy dream and, tweet storms.
But Peter, as Americans, we always think it's about us. And we're talking here about us as a country, but for the rest of the world, when they hear the president-elect say America is back and we're ready to lead, hasn't the world moved on? Hasn't the world changed? Does the world really want America to organize it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think President-elect Biden probably recognizes that it's not simply a matter of returning to where things were 4 years ago, and if he doesn't, that's going to be a challenge for him, because in fact, you're right, the world has moved on to some extent. They've seen in the last 4 years what it's like when America goes in a different direction. I think there's a lot of burned feelings out there about international agreements. Who's going to want to enter a new international agreement with the United States if they feel like 4 years from now it might just be reversed by the next administration? And that's why I think President-elect Biden does have a challenge in terms of deciding what to keep and what not to keep of what his predecessor has done, partly because of the idea of not seeming like we just swing back and forth radically every term. And as Susan correctly, I think, identify the areas where he probably will be different. He probably will adopt more of Trump's positions on China, for instance, maybe not the specific tactics on tariffs, but a stronger position against China than the Obama administration had. You can't just simply rerun the past. You're going to have to adapt the future, and that will include at least some of what the last 4 years has brought to us.
Isabel, I wonder what you think about what happens with the 74 million Americans or so who voted for President Trump. Do you believe fundamentally that their votes were influenced by racism?
Well, I would say just to remind ourselves of that we still have sort of a racialized polarization in our country. We have to remind ourselves that no Democratic candidate for president, no matter how popular he may have been, won the majority of the white vote, and no Democratic candidate for president has won the majority of the white vote since 1964, Lyndon Johnson. And that means that it reflects this impulse among many, many people to protect or to maintain, in my view, the hierarchies or how things have been in the past, the things that people are familiar with and what they feel comfortable with in terms of our past. And that's the challenge that I think we face. I mean, one of the things that I had a chance to do in the process of working on this book was to spend some time in Berlin. And there in the middle of a major world city is this massive, massive structure that's several football fields wide in the middle of a major world city. And that is the memorial to those who perished in the Holocaust. One distinctive thing about it, among many, many things, is that there's no signage. There's no signage to say what it is exactly. And it's not necessary, because while in Germany, people may disagree on many, many things, they're on the same page about the history of what happened in World War II and the history of the country. And we have a long way to go in our country to get on the same page, to understand how we got to where we are, so that we can have a better understanding of where we are right now and what we need to do to go forward.
John Meacham, I know you contributed to the President-elect's acceptance speech, and you've shared with us that you are advising on the inaugural speech. What kind of tone can he strike that can bridge all of the things that we just laid out here? What kind of historical guidance have you given him?
Yeah, I do occasionally. I'm an occasional volunteer advisor on historical matters and some major speeches. And I think that what Isabel just said is really important, which is you have to confront the past to move forward. And that may sound like a needlepoint pillow or a coffee mug somewhere, but it has the virtue of being true. And I would challenge one thing you said, Margaret, or at least offer a slightly different angle of vision on it. I don't think that the 2020 election was about a return to normalcy, exactly. Normalcy itself is a term from the epic Harding-Coolidge years of the 1920s. I think it's about restoration in this sense. It's about having a coherent political and cultural conversation. It's about having a world in which rational policy choices can be presented, debated, and possibly adopted, as opposed to a political system that for 5 years now has been held hostage by the whims of a single man, by a cult of personality from the 45th President of the United States. And so much of our energy, so much of our mind space has been given over to this single person that we need to break that addiction. Mm-hmm. And at a very important point, to go to something Isabel was saying, and Susan, is that Donald Trump may or may not fade as a political force. My personal view is that he's not going to fade, that he'll be there. But Trump is the fullest manifestation of perennial American forces. Nativism, isolationism, racial animus. These are all things that have shaped us from the very beginning. and they're not going away on January 20th. They ebb and they flow.
To that point, though, are you saying that Trump is the symptom or he is the problem?
No, I think he is a manifestation and the fullest expression of these demagogic forces. He's gotten farther than anybody else got. He got farther than Joe McCarthy. He got farther than George Wallace. And he is something that he can't be dismissed, right? And we can't think that a single election is somehow going to redeem the country. Because remember, a republic is a human undertaking. The fundamental nature of who we are is that the public square is this fullest manifestation of our individual dispositions of heart and mind. That's what a republic is. And that's at once kind of scary, because it means that we have, when we look at something and we disagree with it, we think, is that really who we are? Yeah, it really is who we are. I dislike it when people say, including the president-elect, when he says, this is not who we are. Of course it's who we are. Isabel's entire canon of work is about this. Of course we have fallen desperately short of equal justice for all. And the point of America has to be the pursuit of that justice, despite our appetites and ambitions that pull too many of us in the other direction.
Thanks to all of you for the conversation and for joining us today. And Happy New Year. Stay healthy.